to Down Your Unders. Down Your Unders. Review and dissection of content from some of the sharpest minds in the game. Hosted by Adam Camilleri. Art of War. Down Under.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this episode 182 of the Art of War Down Under podcast. My name is always Adam Camilleri, and we got a little bit of a buffer, a little bit of filler. Not so much filler, but we were supposed to, I was really hoping I'd be able to review a balanced data slate and some points and some things like that. And it turns out that's, almost definitely going to be next week or the week after or whatever. We'll see what happens. But here doing a short one with one of my best mates, Mr. Jeremy Martino. Thanks for joining us, brother.
Hi, Adam. Thanks for having me nonetheless.
And I'm going to be completing my review of the Leviathan GT pack, which I did a couple of months ago. Reviewed the missions and all the mission options and the bonus rules and stuff like that. We didn't do the secondaries, and I've kind of kept that review in my back pocket for just this kind of case. I never want to miss an episode. I never want to not give you guys the content, especially the people in the Patreon who've paid for it, signed up for it, expect it, and deserve it. And so we're going to be reviewing each and every one of the secondaries that we have in the Leviathan GT pack. We're going to be talking about them from a high level, what is good about them, what is bad about them, and should there be a new GT pack, does this secondary need to be buffed, nerfed, rewritten, or removed? And we're both going to be giving a hot take on each one as we go. And of course, we'll be weighing it up from a tactical and a fixed perspective. But Jeremy, you got some affiliations, especially with Team Australia. Anything you'd like to plug or mention?
Not really, Adam. I've got an event coming up early next month, so early February, 17th and 18th of February in Melbourne, the Masquerade 7. So if anyone's a local, find us. You can just sign up. You can find the player pack on the BCP event for Masquerade 7. That's about it for me.
Fan-freaking-tastic.
I'm keen to be here.
I'm actually keen to be here. I'm keen to be there as well because I'll be playing in that event if I'm at all able. But mate, let us jump in and review these secondaries. Firstly, we've had a lot of different versions of the secondary structure over the past kind of 3 or 4 iterations of the game. I mean, 6th edition, the Maelstrom cards very first came in. We've seen some cards in the game, some cards out of the game. We played ITC missions, WTC missions, and everything in between. How do you sit with this version of secondaries? And we have the option to play fixed, play tactical, and they're different points for each one. How do you like this system, and how do you feel like it is when you weigh it up against previous?
I think the game's in a really good spot at the moment, to be honest. And I think a lot of people have had a bit of burnout recently. I've spoken to a lot of people that feel there's some burnout with 10th. But to be honest, criticisms that I have of 10th are not related so much to the missions. I think a lot of the burnout's more to do with the way in which kind of the faction releases happen. And we've got a lot of, or there's been at least recently a lack of diversity in armies where a lot of armies are just kind of using similar mechanics, things like devastating wounds and mass lethal hits and things like that to overcome units. And that's a lot of people have a criticism with the kind of compression of rules rather than the missions. So I actually think the missions are in a pretty good spot. Personally, my favorite that I've played in recent years was the ETC missions in the end of 8th edition. I thought they were really good. And I think, to be honest, these missions actually remind me a little bit of those. So, when you talk about, because just for those people listening that weren't around for that or might not have remembered, basically the old ETC missions mixed 3 types of scoring. So you had your progressive kind of cards, like tactical cards, like the Maelstrom cards like we have now. You also had kill points. So any unit that died in its entirety scored a point. And you also had end of game objective scoring. So who scored, who kind of held the map at the end of the game. And to be honest, that kind of like essence is reflected in modern missions where we have our cards, we have our, of course, like we don't have the kill points as such, but we do have that kind of the objectives being scored progressively. And then at the end of the game, it kind of matters as well because we do have that kind of the mission scoring all the way to the end.
Well, I 100% agree. I really love I thought the complexity of those missions you're describing at the ETC level were like maybe 10-15% too much bookmarking and administration to keep everything up and down because there were so many moving parts. But what I loved is that you could play an army that focused on one portion of that scoring. You could focus on an army that played Maelstrom really good, but if you played Maelstrom really good, most of the times that meant you gave up kill points because you'd be an MSU kind of quick army, and of course that would be playing the secondary cards as we play, or playing tactical as we would call it now. And so there's kind of this yin and yang, this balance to be had. And then there was always the last, like the turn 5, turn 6 scramble to get the points at the end if you had enough models. And I used to really love that depth to things, and you could really focus on what your army was going to be good at. With these, I think you're absolutely right. They do echo that definitely to some degree. I would love a little bit more end game. But I do love how, because right now it just feels like progressive is everything. And while that is good, and that's what GW obviously wants, they want us doing things all game, every game. Because you remember how it was at 5th edition, you'd do pretty much nothing for 4 turns, and then you'd start positioning, and turn 5 you'd scramble to see, and then hopefully the game ended if you had the upper hand. And then if you scrambled too early and the game didn't end, you got blown up and your opponent took the objectives in turn 6. And that used to happen all the time. It was like only the back end of the game mattered. Whereas now we have 5 really kind of dynamic turns of the game, but then that gets pulled apart by just kind of how lethal things can get in 10th edition. When you're talking about the burnout, were you talking about the difference between a lot of people are talking people I've talked to reference how it felt like 8th and 9th edition was like an open world RPG. It was like Grand Theft Auto. You could go anywhere. You could take any car. You could drive down any street. You could find whatever path you wanted to play with the game. Whereas 10th edition feels very siloed. Like here's the part of the game you get to play with until you get the DLC of your codex. Here's the index, and you got to DLC the codex, and then you get to play with different bits of it, but not all of it at the same time, just one bit at a time. And it feels very, very different, very design different. Is that a good analogy in your mind?
Yeah, I think that's a great analogy. And I think you're right. I think, for example, in previous editions, like recent editions, like 8th and 9th, when you could join, characters didn't join units, but you could kind of decide the synergies you wanted in a very open way. And then it even got even broader than that in being able to mix armies, being able to ally armies, able to have an army of Imperial Guard with, some Space Marines or Sisters, or, have some different Necron dynasties or whatever it might be. Can't do that anymore. And not only can you not do that, you kind of the game kind of tells you the way you should play it. Like, you put this character in this unit, and then that character gives this unit, lethal hits. So they're kind of telling you what to do. And often the things that are the most dynamic and interesting is when you're playing the game the way that GW kind of overlooked or didn't want you to do. So when you're doing something that's a bit unintended, that's when it seems to be the most fun, which is, I think, probably not a great thing. You should be able to play within the intended boundaries and it still be really interesting and creative.
I agree. And what you're describing, I don't necessarily think is a bad thing. In fact, it's probably a very good thing for making the game more accessible, more open for new players, and more, easily able to get up and going at the competitive level or the event level, which is definitely something they probably thought about. So I do definitely think 10th edition is a great way to get into wargaming. Like if you were to just start at any 40k edition as your very first edition, and then go and play 8th, and even go backwards, you play 10th edition into 9th edition into 8th edition into 7th and 6th. Like, this would be the perfect place to start to get into the game, to learn how to play, and hopefully that means that we're getting. It's going to be pushing boundaries further down. But even that, I don't think it's a bad way to play. I think, like you said, the game's in a very good place. It's still pretty interesting and exciting.
Yeah, great. And I think you're right. I think at the end of the day, as much as veteran players might think, it's the game could go this way, we could do this to make it more complicated or more interesting, we also need to be attracting a large player base. And people, you need to make sure the game is accessible. And I agree with you. I think it's in a very accessible place at the moment. A lot of things just make sense. When you explain something to someone, it just makes sense. And if they know a rule, they might ask you, do you have Scout in your army? And you just say, yeah, this unit has Scout. The universality of the rules is very interesting, but also it allows people to understand what's going on a more broad level.
Yeah. And stuff like that we experienced, especially in 6th and 7th edition, just can't happen anymore. Like, I remember you walking up to a game with me, it was a practice game, and I just brought some random stuff. And I think the first, because we knew each other okay, then we didn't know each other a lot. And you pretty much explained to me how I couldn't win the game before we even started rolling the dice, because it was just like
that sounds like me.
It was pretty good. It was your Barkstar versus I had the list I ended up taking to CanCon, the Killclade and that kind of stuff. And I'm like, I have to tank shock you perfectly, and you have to let me for me to maybe score some points. that was the outcome that I was going to get from that game, and that just doesn't happen anymore. There's no way you walk up to the table and you just be like, I'm sorry, man, I don't think you should play this game. You're going to enjoy your day worse if you try and play my arm, play against me. And that was definitely something that happened in 6th and 7th edition, which I very rarely happened.
Anyway. And the thing is these days, no, you're right. And we have due to just the I guess as you said, like the game growing, a bigger presence on the social media, YouTube, all types of kind of different platforms, Twitch TV, people watching streams and stuff, and obviously you're largely responsible for escalating that part of the game. But just the general skill set of people is also getting better. Like the average player is a lot better now than they were 5 years ago.
100%.
And that means that absolutely, not just because of the rules, but you turn up to a game, you don't recognize someone, they might be new to the tournament scene. That doesn't mean you're going to just win that game, because ultimately it is a dice game. But yeah, people can have a cool combo. Often you learn some of the most interesting things from people that have just looked at the game in a new way and showed you the way something can work. So yeah, it's absolutely a very the ceiling of or the limitations in terms of new play experience have definitely been taken away a lot lately.
All right, let us jump into the meat and potatoes of this review. So we are going through the Leviathan mission secondaries. We're going to, of course, read them out one by one, tell us what you think, tell you guys what we think, etc., etc. There will be a part 2 of this podcast, of course, if you forgot to do it at the start. You can come over and join Jeremy and I, probably continuing a bit of this conversation as we're having right now, the design philosophies of 10th edition, what we like, what we don't like, what we are loving to see, and what we're really looking forward to. But the first secondary we're going to read out is No Prisoners. Whilst the secondary mission is active, each time an enemy unit is destroyed, you score 2 VP, up to a maximum of 5. Note that VP is scored even if such a unit is destroyed and then subsequently returned for any reason. If you score any VP on this secondary mission during a turn, then at the end of this turn, it is achieved. So you can't score 2 on it and then be like, well, I know I'm going to get way more when all his reserves have to arrive on turn 3, so I'm not going to score it now. If you score it regardless. Do you like No Prisoners and No Prisoners style of secondaries? Been in the game forever, for as long as I can remember, mate. Is this a good version of it?
I think it's a good version. It's obviously a card. Sometimes if you draw it on turn 1, it can be hard to score because your opponent's often hiding. So if you're going first and you draw this card, it might not be great to draw turn 1. But outside of that kind of pretty niche scenario, it's often a card you like drawing. I would personally like to see it, for example, it maxed at 6 instead of 5, just, in 2 points, 2 points, 2 points. I think I don't know whether it necessarily needs to be that punitive in making that third kill only give 1 point. So I would definitely like to see it, be kind of go up to 6. I don't think that's a bad thing. I also think this could be a potential fixed secondary. It's something we can obviously talk about later in your Patreon exclusive section, but I do feel like one issue with the game at the moment is the tension between tactical and fixed. And I do think that some of the fixed objectives are too good, but there's also not enough to pick. So I feel like it would be interesting if something like this in a slightly different form could become a fixed objective, which would mean that in certain situations you could pick it and just try to kill your opponent.
Yeah, totally agree. And I think I'm of the opinion it should be. It should be like I think that every secondary mission should be written to be fixed as well as tactical. Why they decided not to, much of the muchness. Second one is secure no man's land. At the end of the turn, if you control 2 or more objective markers in no man's land, this secondary mission is achieved for 5 victory points. At the end of your turn, you control only 1 objective marker in no man's land. It's achieved for 2 victory points instead of 5. I love this. I love this secondary. This is one of my favorites because it tells me and it encourages me to do what I should already be wanting to do every turn: dominate the middle of the board, dominate the mid-board objectives. How do you feel, mate?
Yeah, I like it. I think it's an interesting secondary. It's asking you to do something that sometimes is difficult, but that you're getting a good reward for doing it. It's very rarely impossible to do. So I think it's just good, as you said. It encourages map control. It encourages you to move out, and you can sometimes do it with minimal resource, expenditure. Just put a 1 OC or 2 OC, like a Rhino or a Lone Op or something to help you get the points. And I like that it can be scored just for the 2 if you can only score it with one unit. So overall, I think it's a good secondary, and it's typically pretty achievable. So it's when you draw it, you're very often happy that you draw it.
Yeah, I do believe. I agree with your change to No Prisoners, by the way. I think it should go up to 6, and it should be there should be a fixed option there. I'm very happy for No Man's Land to be completely unchanged. I think that should just be a perpetual, like every secondary mission deck for the rest of this edition. This is a great secondary. Capture enemy outpost is up next. At the end of your turn, if you control 1 or more objective markers in your opponent's deployment zone, this objective marker is achieved. This secondary is achieved, and you score 8 victory points, mate. How do you feel about that?
I like this. I don't feel good when I draw the card. In the sense it's a hard card to score, and often it's a card that you can't score. But I like the fact that it's in the game. I like that the deck does have a couple of cards that are kind of blanks in a way, in that you score them and you draw them and they're not great. But if you can score them and you can build your army to score them, you get rewarded. So I think that as much as people might think this is a shitty secondary and it shouldn't be in the game, I think it's important for a deck of cards like this to have some hard cards. And this kind of card is the exact card that's needed. The only thing I would personally change is that it can be cycled on turn one. That it's like the and we can talk about this later. But that if you're going to have that caveat on cards that it can't be scored turn one, I think this card should be one of the cards that has that.
What? I mean, apart from like a night spinner popping a unit on an objective and a yin kan going over there and taking it, like someone, I'd love it in the chat or in the Discord or in whatever. Someone tell me and describe to me an army that can do this turn one. Like I just don't know of it. I don't know.
Well, the biggest example, from what I know of, from my understanding, is the armies that have like scouting or forward deploy. So Ultramarines that forward deploy, or for example, Dean with his World Eaters that scout forward. Yep. So armies that can move really quickly and scout and just beeline straight for the objective sometimes can score it. So that's interesting. But typically most people can't score it turn one.
And to your point, if it became a thing where everyone could, the overwhelming majority of the things you described probably needed to declare and execute a charge for that to occur to get on that objective.
Yeah, exactly.
So people just don't deploy on the objective then. If everyone starts stacking there, and then you can't do it turn one anyway. So it's like there is a 100% agree. Turn one needs to have the caveat here. Apart from that, I'm happy it's in the deck. But I mean, this just reads to me: if you are winning, you win lots more. Like it is a win more card, but I'm happy it's in the game. Defend Strongholds up next at the end of your opponent's turn or at the end of the battle, whichever one comes first. If you control one or more objective markers in your own deployment zone, the secondary is achieved and you score 3 VP. The secondary mission cannot be achieved during the first battle round. If you draw this secondary mission card during your first battle round, draw a new one immediately, blah, blah, blah. So this is, to me, a lot of the time, this is 3 points. Like as much as the other one was a win more, this one is just like steady the ship kind of a card. How do you feel about it?
Yeah, it's probably one of the least interesting cards in that you really want to be defending your home objective anyway. In the sense, it's your it's an objective that's typically the easiest to control. Obviously, some games it doesn't score, and in those missions, it adds a level of you need to be doing something you wouldn't normally be doing necessarily. Yeah. But for the most part, your home objective is one you need to be holding. So adding this secondary, as you said, it's almost just 3 free points because most people are going to be really protecting it. Also to kind of protect if the opponent scores the previous card we looked at, Capture Enemy Outpost, no one wants to give that to their opponent for free either. So normally when you draw this card, you're kind of happy. Although sometimes late game, when the game gets really scrappy and people kind of have units all around the table, maybe this becomes a card that's hard to keep, hard to score. So I think it's fine. And it's a good mirror to Capture Any Outpost. So I think it's fine that it's in the game. And I like that it scores at the end of your opponent's turn. It gives them a chance to deny you the points, which is good.
That's the best thing about it. But in saying that, I would still be very happy if this card got deleted and something more interesting and interactive was added in its place, despite it being the yin and yang of the previous one.
Yeah, that's fair.
Overwhelming Force is up next. While the secondary mission is active, each time an enemy unit that started this turn within range of an objective marker is destroyed, score 3 victory points up to a maximum of 5. Note that VP scored even if such a unit is destroyed and subsequently rejected, blah, 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 blah. If you score any VP from the secondary mission, you must achieve it. You don't get the chance to, like I said, tick up on the next turn and get more points. This is a very good one as well, right? Because this is just pretty much informing what you want to do turn by turn. But is it the right T's and C's or terms and conditions?
Yeah, I like it. I think it's a card that is incentivizing you to do things that you should already be wanting to do, but it does sometimes get you to pivot your focus of things. Like sometimes you might just want to out OC someone on an objective. This actually makes you want to kill the unit. So I think it's a fine card. I don't think there's anything particularly egregious or weird about it. But it is a little, if anything, a little bit bland for what you said in terms of it just being playing into what you would normally be doing. So it's not necessarily kind of getting you to do something that requires a bit of extra thought or strategy.
Yeah, agreed. I do also think this if there was I wouldn't mind seeing this be one that became fixed, because this isn't one that's fixed. Yeah,
Yeah,
you has to have a little icon at the bottom left to be fixed.
that's right. Yeah, it's not a fixed one. Yeah, it could be for sure.
All right, area denial is up next. At the end of your turn, if one or more units from your army, excluding battle shock units, are wholly within 6 of the center of the battlefield, and there are no enemy units within 6 of the center of the battlefield, the secondary objective is achieved, and you score 5 victory points. If at the end of the turn there are one or more enemy units wholly within 6, but there are no enemy units within 3 of the center of the battlefield, it's still scored. You get 3 VP instead of 5. This is another mission. Secondary that's been in the game for quite a long time, and this is definitely a different iteration of it. I actually think this one is too permissive. I'd rather see this one become a much more of an all or nothing, as in either you get the full 5 or you get absolutely 0. But how do you feel about it?
I agree. I think that second caveat's just the amount of like arguments, or not so much arguments, but just heated discussions and TO calls I've seen about just people trying to work out what that second caveat kind of is specifically saying.
Correct.
I think it's a bit unnecessarily complicated. I agree. I think it could just be the 5 points or none. You either control the center or you don't. I think it's a fine card. I like that it adds another dimension, because normally, I mean, sometimes there is an objective in the center of the battlefield, but a lot of the times there isn't. And I like that it adds another dimension to the game sometimes. So I think cards like this I like, because they add that spice and color to the game, where sometimes if you just look at the kind of traditional primary game you're playing, it can be a bit boring, where you just, holding objectives, denying objectives. When you add extra kind of elements like a different part of the battlefield, so cards like this, cards like Engage in All Fronts, I think they're cards that are definitely interesting and positive.
Yeah, exactly right. All right, Tempting Target is up next. When the secondary mission card is drawn, your opponent must select one objective marker in no man's land. At the end of your turn, if you control the selected objective marker, you get 5 victory points. This might be my favorite card, by the way. This might be my favorite one. You draw the card, you look at your opponent, and you're like, which one's it going to be, mate? And then, of course, they're going to pick the turd sandwich, and they're going to pick the hardest one for you to do. But if you do it, you feel amazing. You get a big dopamine hit as well as your 5 victory points. Do you agree?
I like it. I agree. I think it's for the reason that your opponent's interacting with the card. I think it's really good. I think in some, I understand that GW have been a little bit like, maybe they're using kind of predictable and easy numbers, like round numbers, like just 3 and 5 and stuff. But I think this card could just give 6 points. I think it's fine that you've got a lot of cards just giving 5 or 3. But this one, I think, could be a card that gives 6. I think it's a hard card to score.
Agreed.
And often, just because your opponent gets to choose where you're going, it means that, if they are manipulating the way you're moving models around. So I do feel like this could give more than just the 5 points. So I wouldn't mind seeing this go up to 6 points if they change it.
This one is also one, and I mean, I'm only saying this because this is a lose harder one. If you are losing, if you have lost dominance in the middle of the table, or you've lost agency, and they just pick the worst possible one, and it's literally impossible for you to get, like you don't have a unit that can even move far enough with a charge, with an advance, with an everything, do you think you should be able to cycle this one? Like, if it is physically impossible for you to get a unit to that objective, does your opponent have to choose one that is acceptable?
I don't think so. No, I
think you can argue it both ways.
Yeah, I like that it sometimes is just the card you can't get. And it just means that you're going to need to have the capacity to jump all around the battlefield. It kind of, in some ways, evokes from old tactical, the Maelstrom decks of old, just when you used to draw cards that would tell you to capture an objective number, number 1 or 3 or 5. And sometimes you just couldn't get to that specific objective. Yeah. It's the same kind of premise where you're being asked to capture an objective that is hard for you because your opponent's picking it.
Correct. Exactly right. I mean, I think there's a case to be made that maybe there's a second line here that says, they pick 2 objectives in no man's land, one of them worth like 2 points or something. I don't know. But I think
that could be interesting. Yeah.
Like I said, this is literally my favorite objective, and I would not want to see it change, but I have heard criticism of it. So I wanted to just voice those. Bring It Down is next, and this is the first one that has a fixed option. Whilst the secondary mission is active, each time an enemy monster or vehicle model is destroyed, you score 2 victory points and an extra 1 victory point for each of the conditions below that are achieved or satisfied, and all are cumulative. So the destroyed model has a wound characteristic of 10 or more. the destroyed model has a wound characteristic of 15 or more, or 20 or more wounds. Note that the victory points are scored even if such a model is destroyed and then subsequently resurrected for any reason. If you score any victory points of this, you must achieve it. If you're using the tactical missions, then when this secondary is achieved, you score an extra 1 victory point. However, if you are using the tactical mission, you cannot score more than 8 victory points in total from this secondary. So you can't score more than 8 in the turn that you draw it if you draw it as tactical. How does this go as a fixed objective option? And is it a good one, do you think?
I think it's great that it's in the game. I think it's important that it's in the game because it's obviously something that evokes the previous edition and how we had those, for those who remember, in ninth when you had just fixed objectives, you just picked your secondaries. This was one that people would pick when their opponent had lots of monsters or vehicles. And it's the same kind of thing. If your opponent does have an army that's very monster or vehicle heavy, you will consider bring it down. And I think the fact that this secondary is in the fixed category, it affects army design. And often players, and we've spoken about this on podcasts before, when you kind of look at your army and say, do I have too many vehicles and monsters? Do I need to cut a rhino or cut a tank to bring it down a little bit of a less attractive option? And the fact that it not only is a card that is interesting to draw in the tactical objectives, but it's also plays into army design and it's a balancing factor as well. I think it's a really interesting card. I actually really like the values that it has. I actually wouldn't change it personally.
Yeah, I wouldn't change it personally either. I think it's exactly correct. It's actually, more than anything, it's a balancing factor, I believe. It's a balancing factor against the stats check that can occur to people facing especially knights in the game of 40k. What I do find fascinating is that there is no horde equivalent for this. In many iterations, we've seen, I scored this many victory points for how many wounds you've killed or how many models you've destroyed, regardless of the amount of wounds they had. So usually there would be like you brought unending swarm Tyranids. Well, here's a fixed objective, for killing hordes. That would be the other side of the coin from bring it down. And it's very interesting that this exists, but that doesn't exist, which makes me think that it is what I believe it is. And it's just as much of a balancing factor as anything else. But what do you think about that statement?
Yeah, I agree. And in the past, it would have been a card like No Prisoners would have been the equivalent. Yeah. And I think you could rebalance No Prisoners to be the equivalent in fixed. It could, for example, in fixed, rather than give 2 points per unit killed, it could give, in fixed, like 1 point per 10 wounds killed or something like that.
Yeah, it would be 1 point. 1 point per unit killed, and then a modifier based on how many models and or wounds there were in the unit. Yeah, that's excellent. Sorry, Matt, continue.
Yeah, so I think that could be something to consider, just for the reasons you noted, and also because there are armies like Endless Swarm Tyranids and Necron Warrior Spam and specific types of lists that will make you chew through hundreds of models, and there's no real way to exploit that, which kind of feels a bit weird.
100%. I mean, and the Necron Warriors have much decreased in application, but we have a lot of codexes on the horizon. Orcs are coming soon, 20 boys might be the bee's knees. We saw Kroot. Kroot can go to 20 mans, A guard's going to come along at some point. There's plenty of horde armies on the horizon that definitely could unbalance some things. Next up is the best secondary in the game, deploy teleport homers. In your shooting phase, you can select one unit from your army that is not battle shocked and is eligible to shoot. Until the end of your turn, that unit is not eligible to shoot or declare a charge. At the end of your turn, if that unit is within your opponent's deployment zone or within 6 of the center of the battlefield, it deploys a teleport homer at that location. This second objective is achieved and you score a number of VP depending on which of the ones that you did. If it's the center of the battlefield, it's 3 victory points. If it's your opponent's deployment zone, it is 4 if you're using a fixed missions, or 5 victory points if you're using tactical. So if it's fixed, it's 4 VP for your opponent's deployment zone, or 5 victory points if you're using this as ripped it off the table, or 3 either way in the middle of the board. This is the problem secondary. This is literally the problem secondary of the edition right now. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's the problem secondary because it on its most basic level, like a lot of people would look at this and go, okay, my model doesn't have to be wholly within 6 of the center. It just needs to be within 6. And that's the unit. So you could have a unit of, say you got a unit of scouts or a unit of, flesh hounds, whatever it might be. They can just string back, but just have a model partially within 6 of the center and pop the action, right? And not only is it super easy to score those 15 points because you just do it every turn for 3 points, but it has an upside that you can do it for 4 points. So often when you kind of plan this secondary as a fixed option, you think, well, I might do it 3 or 4 times for 3, and then I might do it 1 or 2 times for 4. So I'll probably score around 16 or 17 points out of 20, which is really good for a secondary that's quite easy to do. So personally, sorry, go on, mate.
No, you go, mate.
I was just going to say, I think my solution, and I'm actually really interested to hear what your ideas are as well. My solution would be to just change it from, I think that in your opponent's deployment zone side of things is fine. I think 4 for fixed and 5 for tactical.
Agreed.
But I think if you do it in the center, I think it should be something like having a unit, either the unit needs to be wholly within 6, or I would actually
100%.
make it the unit needs to be within 3. So rather than wholly within 6, I just go change it to within 3 of the center. Make it harder. Like that caveat, it means that you're much less likely to be able to hide behind terrain and do it. Like a lot of armies have little lone ops or little units they can just hide behind a central piece of terrain, do homers without even being visible. So they just keep doing it. Whereas if you make it a bit harder to do, like within 3, they're more likely to have to pop out and make themselves visible. And it means that terrain packs can play around this by that they can just make it so that, central pieces of terrain are outside of 3 of the center, so they won't screen. Because I think it's just too easy.
Yeah, 100% is too easy. And expanding upon that, forcing TOs right now to have all terrain pieces outside of 6 of the center of the table just leaves one of the most egregious firing lanes you could ever possibly put in a game of 40k. So people can't really do that and maintain some kind of balance between shooting armies and oppressive shooting armies and not. So they have to do it, which means they activate people just auto doing teleport homers. So 100% agree with you. Has to be. I think most likely what will happen is wholly within 6. Within 3 is I think better than wholly within 6, because the biggest issue is you should have to give up the unit. If you are going to do this and have this fixed secondary, you should have to have some fear of losing the unit in the exchange. And cool, if I'm going to give up, if you're going to build an army that gives up 5 units for 5 turns to get the 3 points, I'm kind of okay with that. I can live with that. If that certain armies, Custodes, that's your whole army. You can't, it's not going to happen. Whereas people just having like the one lone op, just doing it for 4 turns of the game or whatnot, or Inceptors doing it for 2 turns because they can, or whatnot. Or there's all sorts of jank ways to do this, and it's far too good. I would actually be advocating, if they don't want to change anything, take this away from the fixed options. Don't let it be fixed anymore. Just delete that bit. Give us some different ones that are fixed. Maybe that's their plan. Maybe that's actually their plan. Potentially. Every 6 months they change.
Another way of dealing with it. Yeah, the biggest problem of it as well, though, is people getting really cheap small units and doing it with, 3 Nurglings or with a Calidus Assassin or something.
Dude,
I think
we're not even talking about the worst one, the single Biovore to auto max deploy teleport homers by shooting a single spore mine every turn. And that doesn't go into the middle of the table. That goes in your deployment zone because there's so few armies that can screen out a deployment zone from a single freaking 25 mil base.
Yeah.
So that is a reason I don't want it to be a fixed objective, because it just means that some armies get an auto max secondary just because they have a Bivor in their army. Yeah.
Yeah, another way to do it is just to change it back to the initial way it was on the original set of cards when it was 2 points for fixed. And then it wasn't really anywhere near as good. That's a way to balance it. But there's a lot of different levers they can pull with it, but I do think whatever changes they make, the current version is too strong and a bit boring. So I agree with you.
And that's exactly right. That's the biggest issue. The secondaries that I want to be fixed options, to me, should all prioritize interaction, being interactive.
Absolutely.
Extend battle lines. At the end of your turn, if you control one or more objective markers in your own deployment zone and one or more objective markers in no man's land, you score this objective for 5 victory points. If you only have 1 unit in your army, then it's achieved if you control an objective marker in the middle of in no man's land, and you get 2 victory points instead of 5. I think this is a perfectly structured secondary, and I'd like to see this continue in exactly the same manner moving forward. What do you think?
Yeah, it's one of the easier ones. And that's the thing. I think at the end of the day, it's okay for the deck to have easy and hard cards.
Yeah.
Not every card needs to be perfectly balanced in their difficulty level. Otherwise, you'll just end up with very there's no point at that point really of using it. It's okay to have a deck where there's some easy draws, some hard draws, as long as both people are obviously playing with the same deck. So I agree that this is a card that it's very rare that you draw this card and can't score it. So it's normally a card you draw and you're happy you draw it, but you do have to put yourself out there a little bit. And sometimes as the game goes on, it's hard to score. I watched the game on stream yesterday, actually. The opponent drew this in turn 5 and couldn't score it. And it cost them the game. So it does matter. These things matter.
Excellent. And I totally agree. And of course, 16 cards. You're going to have some killers. You're going to have some fillers, and we want to get rid of any of the nothing burgers, the ones that don't actually add anything to the game. All right, investigate signals. In your shooting phase, you can select one or more units from your army that are not battle shocked and are eligible to shoot until the end of your turn. The units you selected are not eligible to shoot or declare a charge. And at the end of your turn, each corner of the battlefield that has one or more of the selected units wholly within 9 of it is scanned by your army. If one or more corners are scanned, this secondary is scored for 2 VP, and each corner scanned by your army this turn. So 2 VP for each corner of the battlefield that you scan, up to 8 victory points, obviously, because there's 4 corners, and doesn't cap it at any points. This is a really interesting one. I like this a lot because it's so unintuitive to do. And in all honesty, I've got to tell you, on most of the tables that I play on, especially WTC ones, and some of the the GW ones, the corners of the battlefield are the most exposed positions of the table. They are the most easily, you are going to get probably blown up if your opponent wants to kill you, positions of the table. And there's never an objective in the corner of the table. So most likely you are giving up primary to go and get this. So you really need to really manage your resources in doing this. Most of the time, I get 2 points from this one. I refuse to overcommit unless it's very easy for me to do. I can deep strike 3 Inceptors, but a lot of the time, 3 Inceptors are worth more than 2 victory points to me. So if I know that they're going to die the next turn, I usually don't do it. I'll just usually take 2 points out of this. How do you feel?
I've got mixed feelings. I do like the card because it kind of ties in with the philosophy I mentioned earlier, that it's asking you to do something slightly different from what you're already doing. Because as you said, you very rarely need to or want to be in the corners because the corners are exposed and then normally don't have objectives within 9 of the, well, almost always there's no objectives within 9 of the corner. So it's something that is interesting, and it's asking you to move away from objectives to go into the corner, and it's kind of rewarding you for it. And a lot of the time, and this happens at high levels, you play games and your opponent kind of tells you, just deploying this unit of cultists or just deploying these Nurglings or this Sisters unit, within it's within 15, wholly within 15.
Yeah.
So if I draw the card, I can move 6 and be wholly within 9. So you tell your opponent when you deploy the unit where it is. So there's no argument about whether it can get home it can get signals when you draw it. So I think the card's good. I do think the reward's pretty solid in that if you score it for 3 or 4 corners, that feels pretty good when you score it for 3 sometimes.
Yeah.
But it does tend to reward, and this is something that the action secondaries do. They tend to reward armies that have MSU. So think about an army like Tyranids or Sisters. They love drawing this card, but then you look at an army like Imperial Knights or something that's a bit more elite, Custodes. Custodes hates drawing this card.
Yeah.
So it is something that I feel. Yeah. Maybe it could be changed slightly to be, I don't know actually, but rather than score 2, 4, 6, 8, it could score just 2, 4, and then an extra point for the last 2 quarters or something. I'm not sure, but it's just a little bit punishing at the moment for elite armies.
To me, it's and the next one is engage in all fronts. To me, this is engage in all fronts with hurdles, a pit full of spikes, and some poisonous snakes to negotiate before I get the points. Whereas engage all fronts is very simply negotiate the crosshair and you're good. And usually engage all fronts can be done whilst taking an objective, whilst removing models. I am turning away from everything else that I would logically want to do in the game to get these points. And some armies get to do that because they just have, by dint of just the numerosity they bring to the table. And the others is just this is gay kept. So I do love it though, because it is interesting, because it is different. All right, engage all fronts next. Great. Like I said, at the end of your turn, if you have 1 or more qualifying units, see below, from your army wholly within 3 or more different table quarters, and those units are more than 3 away from any other table quarters, like that crosshair through the middle of the table, like I said, this secondary mission is achieved and you score 4 victory points. If you have qualifying units in units in 4 different table quarters, like I said, 4 points, or 2 victory points if you're in 3 table quarters. While a unit is battle shocked, it is not a qualifying unit. If when you draw the secondary mission card, you only have 1 or 2 qualifying units remaining in your army, you can discard this secondary mission card and draw another one. If you are using the tactical missions, then when this secondary is achieved, you score 1 VP. So that will be 3 or 5 for 3 quarters or 4 quarters. We've had engaged on all fronts in the game since, I think, is it 8th edition? We've had engaged on all fronts.
It's been a while, for sure.
Yeah. How do you feel about this one, this iteration?
I mean, I think it's a good card in that it isn't just telling you to do something that you necessarily would already be doing. You're not always going for 3 quarters, especially not with the caveat of being kind of in the quarter, like that. There's that you need to be that 3 inches additionally deep. So I think it's sometimes something you don't want to do. And I think a card that gets you to do something you don't want to do is typically interesting. It escalates the game. It forces resource management because you have to work out how am I going to do this as cheaply as possible without losing too much on the backswing. So I think it's a good card. It's well balanced, especially in the tactical form. I think tactical is good. But then from the perspective of fixed, I think it's a bit boring. I think, as you said earlier, you can combo this card with things like teleport homers, things like behind enemy lines, and you end up scoring the same objective with one unit. You know, you have one unit that's doing homers and scoring a quarter for engage. And that's kind of, I think, a little bit unintuitive and a bit boring. So I do think that as far as its fixed options go, it kind of is a little bit too similar to some of the others.
Yeah, totally agree. All right, moving on to cleanse. In your shooting phase, you can select 1 or more units from your army that are not battle shocked and are eligible to shoot until the end of your turn. Units you select are not eligible to shoot or declare a charge, whatever. I should just say units that can do an action, because that's what that should be called. At the end of your turn, each objective marker that is not within your deployment zone that you control, that is 1 or more of the units that didn't do anything on it, is cleansed by your army. If 1 or more objective markers are cleansed by your army this turn, this secondary mission is achieved and you score a number of VP depending on the number of objectives you cleanse. 1 victory point will score you 2 if you're using fixed, or 3 if you rip this card for tactical. 2 or more is 4 or 5, depending. So cleansing 2 gets you the max points possible. I personally quite like cleanse. It means you're putting a unit on an objective, usually in an exposed or risky position, that's committed to not doing anything, a la they're giving up their ability to defend their position in the middle of the board. In exchange for points. So I generally like cleanse, and I liked it as a fixed option. But once again, it is the one that I like the most, but of the ones that are not interactive, if that was an easy way to say that. What do you think, mate?
I agree totally. I think I like that there's a cost to it. Unlike a card like Extend Battle Lines, where you just jump on the objective.
Exactly.
This actually makes you do something, and I just think that is cool, and it forces you to consider in your army, can I have some fast action monkeys in my army that can jump to objectives without advancing, because once they advance, they become ineligible to shoot, unless, of course, they have assault weapons. So it makes you think about that in your artless creation. Do I have a unit of fast troops that can jump out and cleanse an objective while being eligible to do an action, and I'm not too worried about losing their shooting? So it kind of informs army creation, which I think is cool, and I definitely agree with you. I think it's one of the better ones that, of that bunch of few that require a condition.
Yeah, agreed. Next up is Assassinate. If you are using fixed objectives, then while this secondary mission is active, each time an enemy character model is destroyed, you score 4 victory points. If you're using this tactically, then at the end of your turn, if either of the conditions below are met, you get 5 victory points. 1 or more enemy character units are destroyed during that turn. All character units from your opponent's army have been destroyed in this battle. Note, if you're using the tactical objectives, this secondary mission is achieved even if such a unit was destroyed and then subsequently resurrected. So a Celestine or a Chronomancer, or a Cryptek of some variety, anything that dies and gets back up, which is quite a few. Fugan does that, the Phoenix Gem. There's quite a few things people are incentivized to take in the game at the moment that it's on a character that dies and gets back up. They'll still score you Assassinate. We've always, I think forever, this is what, Slay the Warlord has turned into. It's turned into this card in this mission pack. How do you feel about Assassinate's T's and C's?
Yeah, I think it's a good card. I think similar to something like Bring It Down, it's important that it's in the game.
Yep.
From just a balance perspective, it means that if you take too many characters, you become vulnerable.
Yep.
And I do think my only criticism of it is often, and I'm not sure what other people think, but when sometimes you draw it and you feel like sometimes you just can't score it at all because your opponent has just got their characters protected. And then other times you'll kill like 3 characters in a turn and you only score 5 points. I feel like it should be closer to bring it down. In that it maybe you score 3 points or 4 points per character, but it can go higher. You can do more than just one. So rather than, for example, the way I would balance it is just not give the additional point in tactical. So in tactical, you score 5 points if you kill a character. I would just leave it at 4 points for killing a character, but you could score it up to 8, for example, if you kill 2 characters. Something like that could be interesting, or even 4 for one character and then 2 for the second to go to 6, just to allow for people that want to go and try to kill more characters. That's the time you want to score that card when you draw Assassinate. Same with Bring It Down. Bring It Down facilitates that additional scoring, and I think that could be woven into this card for tactical.
I think so as well. I totally, entirely agree. But how do you feel about this as a fixed option? For me, most of the time, I refuse to take this as a fixed option because I always just feel like it's a trap. Unless people are playing, a lot of big stompy knights, that big Questoris knights that kind of are all characters. There isn't a lot of the time where I can pick this as a fixed option with confidence. That my opponent can't mess with me or deny me the points. It is a lot better now. Like, you can, funnily enough, like if you have an army that's good at killing wraiths and someone brings 18 wraiths, that means you've got 3 characters to kill because, they're attached to the units now. You can't just keep them, or, can't keep 6 of them in a venom on the back of the board like we used to be able to. But do you feel like it's a trap in fixed, or do you feel like it's open for play and should be used as much as possible?
Well, I think it depends on the game and the players, and I think that's what makes it an interesting fixed secondary. Because it's always going to be interactive, and there's always that option that if you pick it, that player with the wraiths can just play really defensively. And when you thought they had to rush those wraiths at you, they just go, no, I'm just going to defend and outscore you on secondaries. And it's really interesting that it facilitates that level of adaptability. So I like that it's an interesting secondary in a fixed mode. It's good that it's in the game because it means if you just take too many characters, you can be punished. But it also has counterplay, like what you said. So I don't think it needs to be changed in the fixed form, but I do think the tactical form is a little bit like just granular. Not granular, the opposite of granular. It's just binary. It's you either score it or you don't. Mm-hmm. You either kill 4 characters and get 5 points, or can't kill a character, get 0. I feel like it could be a little bit more, granular.
I agree. Storm hostile objective is our second last. At the end of the turn, if either of the below conditions are satisfied, this secondary mission is achieved, and you score 4 victory points if you're using fixed, or 5 if you're using tactical. If you control one or more objective markers that was controlled by your opponent at the start of your turn, your opponent did not control any objective markers at the start of your turn, and you control one or more objective markers that you did not control at the start of your turn. The secondary mission cannot be achieved during the first battle round. If you randomly drew this secondary mission card during the first battle round, you can draw another card. This is an interesting one, and the one that I think is very necessary to the game. So this all rolls around, taking objectives off your opponent, ones that they had. Or I've never had the second dot point achieved. I don't know if you have, mate.
No, I haven't.
Yeah, I wonder why they bothered. But I've never had that second dot point achieved. Is this a good secondary otherwise?
Well, I mean, it was in the game last edition with Space Marine secondary that had just essentially the secondary when they had to take objectives. What was it called for Space Marines? It was I've forgotten now.
I think it was Storm of Battle or something. But yeah, I thought it had Storm in it.
Yeah, but they basically had the same secondary, and it was good then. And I think it is still good now. And when you draw it, it's achievable. You just deny an objective, which is something you already want to do. So it's playing into the way the primary is already ebbing and flowing. And then you get a free cycle if you do score at turn 1, if you draw at turn 1. So it is good in the tactical deck. When you draw it, you're pretty happy normally. However, it is cool to counterplay against it. What a lot of people do, and I've often seen this in high-level play, is people denying objectives by equaling the OC. So if you've got, say, 6 OC on an objective, you just place 6 of your own OC on so that you actually never control the objective. So if your opponent scores this, it's harder to get. So I like that it's got that counterplay.
that is the level of play that I adore about this secondary deck, and that it has inspired. It was Shock Tactics, by the way. I literally opened up the 9th edition Space Marine one. Shock Tactics. 3 points at the end of the battle round if you control more objective markers that are controlled by your opponent. That's hilarious. That's the first time I've opened up that in years. But yeah, I think it's a very good secondary. How do you feel about this as a fix?
Yeah, it's good. It's interesting as a fix because it's really goes to show how the level of play is rising, because this was a really good secondary last edition.
Yeah,
and correct. When people, Space Marine players would often pick this, people were pretty salty because they were like, oh, this is so easy. You just play the game. All you're doing is playing the game and you're scoring your secondaries. Whereas not much has changed, and it's not very good. Like, I don't see it being picked around. Like, is it 3 points or 4 points when you score it in fixed? I think it's 4 points, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's essentially the same as what it was. Yet it's not really seen often, primarily because I think people have just gotten better at knowing how to deny this.
Correct. I totally
if you pick his secondary, your opponent's just going to sandbag one objective, make it really hard for you to score. And then the other one in no man's land, they'll deny on equal OC with you. They'll just go, okay, you have 2 OC, I'm going to put 2 OC. You have 4 OC, I'm going to put 4 OC. And they're not going to let you score it. And it's so interesting that it's even within this year or so. And I'm sure there's more complicated reasons as to why it's not being picked as a fixed. But it seems like players have just kind of outgrown this type of thing. And it's not very good in fixed. So
I love the way you unpack that. I think it perfectly encapsulates the way the game is growing and evolving. And 100%, I've never picked this. I've never picked this one. I've never picked Assassinate. I think I've tried out most of the rest of the fixed objective options. But yeah, those Assassinate and Storm Hostile, never done it for exactly your reason. Too much control that your opponent has, and people have learned. It's amazing. Last one, because we're not doing the gambits because I've never heard of them. Behind enemy lines. At the end of your turn, if 2 or more units from your army, excluding aircraft, are held within your opponent's deployment zone, the secondary mission is achieved and you score 4 victory points or 5 if using tactical. If at the end of your turn, only 1 unit from your army, excluding aircraft, is held within your opponent's deployment zone, it is scored, it's still achieved, but you get 3 victory points instead of 4 or 5 if you are using tactical. This is good. Behind enemy lines has been something that's always in the game. This one is another one that you pointed out as an issue for fixed, because a Biovore can be shot into the enemy deployment zone for deploy teleport homers for 4 points and 3 victory points for one. And 3 victory points. On fixed, it's kind of nuts that 125 mil base will generate 7 points of secondaries being shot at from the other deployment zone. So definitely this is a problem one, but I don't see it as bad as deploy teleport homers. I think if you fixed deploy teleport homers, a lot of the behind enemy lines issues would go, and it's pretty much just the Biovore that makes me feel like this is a major problem. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something that's it's very achievable, and it rewards specific types of interaction, and it's also asking you to do something you normally don't want to do, or you aren't normally planning to do. Like, obviously, sometimes you want to go and try and deny your opponent's home objective, but it's not something that's necessarily woven into your turns 1, 2, 3 plans. So it's asking you to do something a little bit out of the box, which sometimes you can do with throwing a unit forward to do it. So I kind of like that. And I think in a tactical context, it's a really interesting and difficult but rewarding card. But I do think that the fixed option is a bit, as we've spoken about and you mentioned, a little bit problematic in how it combos with other similar fixed missions in a way that you're allowing 1 unit to score 2 things. I think that's the problem. And I'm not sure how to fix it, but I do think there's a problem when 1 unit can do behind enemy lines and homers and, or behind enemy lines and engage. I think that's a problem.
Yeah, I agree. And that's the root of a lot of the criticisms that we have about the secondaries. That some of the easy ones are just really easy, and the rest is like medium to hard, or doing some things that you don't want to normally do and having to make tough choices. Then there's just free points. There's just points on the table, and if you're building an army or having a faction that just gets those points for doing absolutely nothing, and it really feels like there's quite a bit of a disparity Like you said, Custodians is a great one to point out that, you know, they have so few units that a lot of the time they'll pull cards that have them doing things that don't result in them, you know, taking and holding primary. It's a real toss-up whether the secondary deck that they pull or is worth doing. So that some of the times they're better off just taking one solid fixed objective, one very iffy fixed objective, and that's better than just seeing what they get off the top of the deck.
Yeah, that's all. And, you know, it's also kind of does encourage a diverse army. So for Custodians armies, often you'll see them incorporate some quicker units.
Yeah. Sure.
Like some, you know, Assassin, for example, or some of the cheaper mounted Sisters of Silence in Rhinos. It is cool to see that, but I agree a lot of it's because some of these secondaries are a little bit punishing.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Overall, how much do you? We're just into the wrap up stage. Overall, how much do you like this secondary deck, and how well structured do you think this system is?
I do like it, and I think the cards themselves are interesting. I think there is room for some additional ones. I do think they could add a couple of cards that kind of in the vein of some of the cards we've spoken about, like Tempting Target, like Investigate Signals, are a little bit different and encourage slightly divergent kind of actions. I think that would be cool. However, I do feel like it's a pretty interesting array of cards, and having settled into the edition now, I think it definitely allows for a dynamic and game that you can still play into. You can still build your list to be able to score these cards. So you might make sure you have some quick units in your army that can jump out and get Tempting Target on turn 1, for example.
Yeah.
However, I do feel like and this is something we can kind of, and I'm keen to hear your opinion on this as well. I think there's probably a little bit more to the mechanic of the way cards cycle. I think that's really interesting, how you can, you know, discard a card for a CP, or you've got your new orders for 1 CP. You can do once per game. I think there's probably a little bit more we could do with that. So the cards themselves could be balanced, but I think we could also balance the way that we use the cards as well. That could help to make it a little bit more interesting as well.
Yeah, I do agree with that call. I think unpacking, and maybe we'll do this in part 2, unpacking, you know, how we cycle, how we score, how we, you know, turn cards into CP, for example, can possibly be revamped, tweaked, or, you know, rewritten. But I definitely want to see some change to the secondary mission deck if we do get a new GT pack. Having some of these cycle out completely, you know, possibly come back in the future. Having some rewritten, changed, and most of all, I just want anything that's truly non-interactive. Not be a fixed secondary option. I love it to be the stuff like Bring It Down, stuff like Assassinate, stuff like Storm Hostile. You know, things that require you to interact with your opponent should be the stuff, you know, that is the fixed objectives. On that note, we're going to wrap this up. Thank you so much for joining us, brother. Really appreciate your time and your expertise. I know neither of us got to go to Uprising, so this is why we're kind of doing this episode. This is kind of me and Jesse hang out, talk some smack, and you know, record an episode while we're doing so. So thank you very much, mate.
Thanks so much for having me, mate. It's always a pleasure.
It is always a pleasure. Good luck to you in your endeavors. I'll see you at Masquerade. We'll be throwing some dice, and you'll be walking around being your joyful self. And I can't freaking wait. But we'll see you guys on part 2. Join us over there, Art of War Down Under, over on Patreon.
See you soon.
Thank you for listening to Art of War Down Under, a content review podcast for Warhammer 40K, hosted by Adam Camilleri, produced by Seamus Ronan. Enjoyed the show? Want your lists reviewed and the content you heard put into practice? Sign up to our Patreon and connect with us online or on Facebook. Just search for Art of War Down Under. Signing out from tomorrow.